Over the weekend, the Senate managed to pass the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which includes provisions pertaining to climate change, also some provisions pertaining to tax increases for corporations and the ultra wealthy. And there are provisions in there in regard to health insurance and healthcare in America. For the purposes of this portion of the story, I want to focus on the climate provisions, what the legislation means, and what is likely to happen after the House passes its version of this legislation. Now, let me begin with the good, okay? For some of the people who are incredibly sensitive to any criticism or critique toward the Democratic Party, let's do the sandwich method, okay? I'll ease you into the information you need to know by starting off with the positives in this legislation. So according to what we know so far in regard to what the Senate has passed in this bill, the bill would invest nearly $400 billion over 10 years in the tax credits aimed at steering consumers to electric vehicles and prodding electric utilities toward renewable energy sources like wind or solar. That is good. What I particularly like about that is that there is money allocated specifically for ordinary Americans, so they have some subsidies, they get some support from the federal government when it comes to purchasing electric vehicles. There is a mineral shortage that is incredibly necessary for the batteries of electric vehicles. That is expected to drive up the costs of these vehicles in the next few years. And it is incredibly important that the federal government offers support to ordinary Americans so they're not left, trying to figure out what to do when there's all this pressure to purchase cars that are much better for the environment. Now, the tax credits do include $30 billion to speed the production of solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and critical minerals processing. $10 billion to build facilities to manufacture things like electric vehicles and solar panels. And there's also $500 million through the Defense Production Act for heat pumps and critical minerals processing. So there's money allocated for the manufacturing of these products. There's money allocated for ordinary Americans to be able to purchase electric vehicles. So far, so good. Let me give you more. Energy experts, this is the part that I want you to be careful with, okay? This is what the New York Times reports. But it's not just the New York Times. Every single publication uses the same wording. Energy experts said the measure would help the United States cut greenhouse gas emissions by 40%, below 2005 levels by the end of this decade. Okay, so let's pause right there. Who are the energy experts, and can we please see that analysis? I have yet to see any analysis. I have yet to read a single report that specifies who these supposed energy experts are. Are they energy experts who work for oil and gas lobbies? Are they energy experts who focus on renewable energies? What kind of analysis have they done? What kind of methodology are we talking about? Everyone's just kind of taking what these reports say at face value without any specificity. That's a small issue I have here, but I do think it's incredibly important for the media to be specific about what they're referring to when they just vaguely say energy experts. But let me continue. Far more will be needed to help keep the planet from warming to dangerously high global temperatures, scientists said. Which scientists? Again, I mean, we need to be specific, but Democrats considered it a momentous first step after decades of inaction. So again, there are positive elements to the climate portion of this bill, but what I am concerned about is whether those positive investments in renewable energies will be negatively mitigated by the handouts that will be given to fossil fuel companies. So now we get into some of the negative components. And what you'll hear from some of these Democrats who have given into these ridiculous concessions is that, well, we needed to get Joe Manchin on board, so we had to do all these favors for fossil fuel companies. Okay, I would argue that Joe Manchin is actually incredibly weak, has very thin skin, and if you're willing to use the bully pulpit, if you're willing to apply pressure, if you're willing to rally for a much more robust renewable energy bill in his state that would actually provide jobs and benefits in his state, he might actually provide concessions for Democrats, not the other way around, but they didn't play that game. So nonetheless, here's what we know so far. So the bill would also force oil and gas companies to pay fees as high as $1,500 a ton to address excess leaks of methane. So far, this is good. It's a powerful greenhouse gas, as we all know. And it would undo a 10-year moratorium on offshore wind leasing established by President Donald Trump. So far, that's good. I have no problem with that whatsoever. But one great way of preventing methane leaks is to, maybe start winding down on fracking for natural gas, which typically leads to methane leaks. But that is not what's going to be happening in the future. Based on the wording of this legislation, there could actually be an expansion of fracking for natural gas. So let's get into that. What does that mean? Democrats agreed to a number of fossil fuel and drilling provisions as concessions to Joe Manchin of West Virginia, a holdout from a conservative state that is heavily dependent on coal and gas. Now, there are other concessions that they made. For instance, the measure would assure new oil drilling leases in the Gulf of Mexico and Alaska's Cook Inlet. It would expand tax credits for carbon capture technology, which is mostly garbage. This is a PR mechanism that's used to convince Americans that it's okay to continue using dirty fossil fuels because we'll do carbon capture. It would mandate that the Interior Department continue to hold auctions for fossil fuel leases if it plans to approve new wind or solar projects on federal land. So do you understand how that works? The timing is important. So before you could even consider new projects for wind and solar on federal land, you have to first provide new leases for oil and gas drilling. That comes first, that's number one. I think that's a bit of a problem. And I have not seen any sound analysis showing what kind of impact that'll have on the positive components of the climate provisions in this bill. Everyone's just kind of saying, but even with all these negative provisions, it's okay because it's a net positive. Is it? Where's the analysis that shows that? I would like to see it. I don't just want to take what corporate media says at face value, but I'll continue. The legislation includes components that are helpful to our business, said Rich Walsh of Valero. He said this during the fossil fuel giant's earnings call. And I've, by the way, shared this with you before. I've shared that quote with you in our prior coverage of this bill. And the reason why I do it is because if you have CEOs of fossil fuel companies say, this is tight, we like this, maybe we need to reconsider whether or not this is a bill that goes far enough in getting us where we need to be in cutting, carbon emissions. I'm just putting that out there. In fact, Kathleen Gama, who's the president of Western Energy Alliance, says this bill forces them not to neglect oil and natural gas. So the idea of responding to the climate emergency appropriately by expanding oil and natural gas drilling in the country just seems strange to me. I feel like journalists should be asking more questions about that, but I haven't seen the right questions being asked. I've just seen reporters take what, the Senate is saying at face value. They vaguely mention that energy experts say this is great, it's gonna cut carbon emissions by 40%, which by the way is still not where Biden said he wanted to be. He wanted to cut carbon emissions by 50%. But nonetheless, they just take what the Senate says at face value and they roll with it. Now, one other thing that Manchin did receive as a concession here is a 304-mile gas pipeline that actually runs through his state. This was a huge priority for him, mostly because his corporate donors have made it a major priority of his. And I'll give you the numbers in just a moment. But this is the pipeline that we've talked about before. It runs through West Virginia through the Appalachian Mountains. It would transport Appalachian shale gas 300 miles from West Virginia to Virginia. It's interesting because there are citizens in Virginia who are outraged by this because work on this project had already begun. There were all sorts of environmental concerns, especially concerns in regard to contaminating drinking water in the area. And there have been people living in West Virginia who spoke to the press who were like, great that they had all these closed door negotiations and conversations. We weren't privy to those negotiations. We were not spoken to at all about these negotiations, and this is a pipeline that's going to negatively affect us, but it doesn't seem like anyone in the Senate seems to care about that. Now, why is this a priority for Joe Manchin? You just follow the money. It's so easy. You don't have to be a genius to be a decent journalist, okay? I'm not a genius at all. I just understand how incentives and disincentives work. In this case, the incentive is money for Joe Manchin, both personally through his personal financial investments in fossil fuel companies and coal, and also when it comes to his own political campaigning. Let's get to those numbers. So natural gas pipeline companies have dramatically increased contributions to Manchin from just $20,000 in 2020 to more than $331,000 so far this election cycle. Manchin has been by far Congress's largest recipient of money from natural gas pipeline companies this cycle, raising 3 times as much from the industry than any other lawmaker. Gee, I wonder if that might have an impact on how politicians behave or what politicians fight for when it comes to this kind of legislation. Now again, I think this pipeline is a disaster. I would prefer that it is not included in this legislation. However, if it is a small concession relative to the positive climate provisions in the bill, great. But I'm not convinced because there hasn't been a single journalist who has shown us that analysis yet. And I'm not gonna just take what the Senate says at face value. More, because Manchin is not the only one taking bribes from fossil fuel companies. I think this is very relevant. Because when we talk about concessions to Manchin, it's always framed as, well, these Democrats, what can they do? What can they do? They really wanted to ensure that there was no expansion for drilling for natural gas and oil, but what could they do? Except it seems like they like to lean on Manchin as the heel. What do I mean by that? Well, let's get to Chuck Schumer here, who's of course Senate Majority Leader. Next Era Energy, a utility giant and stakeholder in the Mountain Valley Pipeline, is a top donor to both Manchin and Senator Chuck Schumer, who negotiated the pipeline side deal with Manchin. Schumer has received more than $281,000 from Next Era this election cycle. I'm sure that had absolutely no impact on Schumer's decision to just cave and give all these concessions to Manchin. I'm sure, Manchin really had to twist his arm, right? Or maybe Manchin didn't really have to twist his arm. Maybe Manchin was a convenient excuse. Maybe we need to follow the money. Maybe the reporting needs to reflect what's really taking place here with money influencing the behavior of our politicians to essentially work against us, ordinary Americans, and work in favor of fossil fuel companies. But again, I'm gonna hold out hope that maybe, just maybe, that even with all these negative climate provisions in the bill, the positive climate provisions will outweigh the negative, maybe. But I'm not convinced yet because again, we haven't seen the evidence. We haven't seen the analysis. We don't know what the methodology is, and we certainly don't know who these energy experts are. But we'll wait and see. And in the meantime, people can get angry at me for just merely mentioning the negative provisions, but they exist whether you like it or not.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.